Let us bow in prayer. Gracious and loving God, your creative power surrounds us each day. Your eternal love is near, seeking to draw us close to your heart, filling us with your peace and your love. Help us to be open to your closeness, O God. Help us to be open to you in a special way in these next few moments. May you be pleased to use my words, all of our thoughts, all of our meditations, that through them and in spite of them, we might gain an added measure of your truth and of your love. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen. When I was a teenager, I discovered a book called The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. And Corrie was then an older woman who wrote about her experiences during the Second World War. She and her sister Betsy were unmarried siblings who worked with their father in a watchmaking business in their home in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands were conquered and occupied by Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And I believe Corrie was about 56 years of age when this happened. And this devoutly Christian family found themselves hiding Jewish people in their home when the Nazis began to implement laws and do roundups of Jewish people, sending them to concentration camps and ultimately to death for most of them. Now Corrie and her family were eventually discovered, arrested, sent to prison, and ultimately to concentration camps, where Corrie was the only survivor from her family after the war. Now the book, The Hiding Place, tells about her experiences, but primarily it tells about Corrie's experience of God and faith that sustained her, and what she describes as the hell that she and others experienced. Now, after the war, Corrie became an evangelist of faith, telling others of her experience of God's love that sustained her. And in a subsequent book, whose name escapes me now, she tells a story about speaking to a gathering of people after the war about her experience of God's love and forgiving power. At the end of the talk, a German woman came up to talk to her, touched by what she had heard. And Corrie recognized her as one of the most cruel of the guards at the concentration camp. And I believe the woman recognized Corrie, but I'm not certain about that. The woman asked for forgiveness and offered her sincere regret for all that had happened. And Corrie said that on her own, she would never have been able to forgive that woman for all that she had been part of and all she had done to prisoners. But drawing upon the strength and love of God, she reached out, shook this woman's hand, and called her sister, for through faith that woman was now her sister in Christ. The power of faith, the power of forgiveness, is what the gospel lesson from Matthew is about today. And while we often say the word forgiveness in worship and Christian faith, it's far easier to talk about it than to do it or to practice it. And today we see that it was also a challenge even amongst the earliest followers of Jesus long ago. So Matthew has written his story with his church in mind, his church that exists many years after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. So he looks to the memories of Jesus' teaching to instruct his church, which experiences conflict just as all churches and organizations do from time to time. So the story is told. Matthew pictures Peter asking about conflict within the church. Peter asks about forgiving his brother or sister within the church, within the faith. And so the question is, how often should I forgive them? As many as 7 times? And Jesus answers not 7, but 77. Or some translations of the Greek say 70 times 7. It's uncertain, but it doesn't matter what the original number is. The effect is the same. It's a lot. 7 is a holy number in the Jewish faith. And biblical scholar Charlotte Dudley Claiborne interprets this little passage this way. She says, Peter is saying, in effect, must I practice perfect forgiveness? And Jesus responds, in effect, your forgiveness must be beyond perfect. It must be beyond counting. Now, at this point, I'm sure all of us will say, well, that's it for me. I can't do that. There are people I can't forgive. There are people I don't want to forgive. There are people I believe don't deserve to be forgiven. But still, forgiveness is a key concept within the Christian movement and within Jesus' teaching. So Matthew's story, remember he's teaching his church, he now records a parable of Jesus as a way to address the importance of forgiveness in response to Peter's question. And the parable is a stark one. I don't like it. The parable goes like this. There's a king who settles accounts with his, a translation would be slaves or servants of his. Now one servant owes 10,000 talents. And Leona's translation made it millions of pounds, which is a good idea to get the sense of it, because the amount, scholars tell us, is an impossible amount to pay. It's not just $10,000 or $10 million, it's impossible to pay. And the king orders this servant, who is like a minister in the government, to have his property sold, his wife, his children, and himself sold into slavery because he isn't paying this debt. The servant begs for time to pay everything, which the king and everyone knows is impossible. He'll never pay it. But then, after he begs for mercy, the king surprisingly says, I release you from your obligation. I forgive your debt. Now, in this parable, the king is meant to represent God, and this surprising act of forgiving the debt represents the depth of God's forgiveness. When we sin, which means to fall short of what God intends, and when we cannot make it right, God still offers forgiveness. God offers to love us unconditionally, with no strings attached. However, this parable then goes on to show that there is some limitation to this amazing grace and love of God. The parable shows, to tell a story where this servant of the king now meets someone who owes him money, a very small amount. But rather than giving this small-time debtor more time to pay, rather than forgiving him the small debt, after all, he has just been released from a mountain of impossible debt by his king. What happens is this forgiven servant grabs the person who owes him a pittance by the throat, even when the man asks for more time to pay. And the forgiven servant refuses and has the other man thrown into prison. Now, a word in the parable says the word gets back to the king, who's furious, withdraws his forgiveness of debt, and throws his servant into prison, where, it says, he is tortured until he'll repay the impossible debt. And then the parable concludes that God will respond in the same way to those who do not forgive their brother or sister. Now, it's a harsh and scary ending to the parable. And while the imagery comes from the ancient world of a violent and often inhumane justice system, we must not, I would suggest, focus on that violence of a human justice system and lay that on top of the spiritual reality of God and say that's what God's spiritual reality is like. Rather, we need to take seriously the teaching that lies behind the imagery of this parable, which comes from a long time ago. Remember, a parable is a made-up story, and Jesus made the story up in order to make a point. So don't get trapped in the imagery from long ago. Let's figure out what the point is. Now, the point seems to be that God is willing to offer radical, unconditional, complete, freeing, liberating forgiveness. But we can lose that forgiveness. Not so much because God changes God's mind, not because we mess up in some way, but I think we lose the forgiveness of God when we never truly accept or receive it in the first place. You see, the man in the parable really didn't receive the forgiveness of the king. He simply thought of what happened to himself as a close call. And wasn't he lucky not to be punished? But I would suggest that he never really accepted or received the power of God's forgiveness, which the king represents, because he did not have forgiveness in his heart for someone else. He never truly allowed the forgiveness of God's love to enter his heart, so therefore he had nothing to give to others. In the parable, when the king takes back the forgiveness, I wonder if really the parable is telling us that when we never truly accept God's forgiveness, we continue to live in a world of harsh, punishing reality where we will suffer just as much as those we never forgive and suffer. Well, what does Christian faith teach us about forgiveness? Well, there are centuries worth of reflections on that. But I'd suggest three things to consider for today. What Christian faith teaches us about forgiveness. First of all, forgiveness is a gift from God that is not dependent on our making everything right or living perfectly in order to get it. If we lived perfectly, we wouldn't need forgiveness. But God always stands ready, our faith says, to embrace us with forgiving love. We don't deserve God's forgiveness. We never will be perfect. It is a gift. And God always stands ready with a hand reaching to us, inviting us to start again. And when we allow God's forgiveness to touch us, then we are changed and we are healed. Secondly, forgiveness is meant to be one of those spiritual strengths and signs and guideposts for the Christian community. But forgiveness does not mean that we say injustice, cruelty, hurts that are done do not have consequences, or that they do not matter. There's a Presbyterian minister, writer, and retreat leader named Marjorie Thompson from the United States. And this is what she's written about forgiveness. She says, to forgive is to make a conscious choice to release the person who has wounded us from the sentence of our judgment, however justified that judgment may be. Forgiveness represents a choice to leave behind our resentment and desire for retribution, however fair such punishment may seem. Forgiveness involves excusing persons from the punitive consequences they deserve because of their behavior. The behavior remains condemned, but the offender is released from its effects as far as the forgiver is concerned. Forgiveness means the original wound's power to hold us trapped is broken. When Corrie ten Boom found God's strength to shake the hand of her former prison guard, she was deciding to release the person from her desire for revenge and to accept the guard's genuine desire for forgiveness. And she was also deciding to free herself from the hatred towards this former guard that filled her in her heart and trapped her in some ways. Forgiveness is about being free, liberated in God's love. Forgiveness comes so the victim can be free of the hurts and pain of the past, just as much as the person who caused the hurt. Sometimes when we carry a hurt, a burden from the past that has not been addressed, the pain remains in our hearts, minds, spirits. Sometimes when we cannot forgive others, we become bitter, we become suspicious, we become angry towards everyone, even the ones we love. If, on the other hand, we have caused hurt, we need to ask for forgiveness, seek to make amends as much as possible. Sometimes it's not completely possible. And in that act, we discover freedom. When we can forgive someone, it frees us to move on. Forgiveness means deciding that we will not seek revenge, deciding that we will not desire retribution. Neither will we say that what was done was right. Forgiveness means we will move on with life. We will be free. Many of you will know Harold Kushner, who was a famous rabbi and author. And he wrote a story, tells a story of a congregation member who was a single mother, struggling to make ends meet, divorced from her husband, who had abandoned her. And her former husband now had a very good and comfortable life in another place with a new family. And the story he tells, he says, she asked Harold, how can she forgive her husband when she is so angry and feels the pain of her situation? And Harold responds, I'm not asking you to forgive him because what he did was acceptable. I'm asking you to forgive because he doesn't deserve the power to live in your head and turn you into a bitter, angry woman. I'd like to see him out of your life emotionally, but you keep holding on to him. You're not hurting him by holding on to that resentment, but you're hurting yourself. Forgiveness is meant to be freeing for us as well as the other. Thirdly, the power of forgiveness is not just for individuals, but also for communities, for societies, for nations. Think about it. When wars cease, when conflicts end, when injustices are addressed in the world, healing, new, justice-filled beginnings and relationships need to be found. And a measure of forgiveness needs to be established in order for the world and life to go on. It's not a matter of saying what happened was right. It's a matter of saying we need to move on. The message of the parable, I would suggest, is that it shows us a call to receive God's freeing, grace-filled forgiveness so that we can practice God's freeing, grace-filled forgiveness for others. The parable is a call to make God's freeing, grace-filled forgiveness a mark of the Christian community and indeed the world. But this call to forgiveness is not something we are asked to do by ourselves or in our own power or strength. God promises to touch our hearts when we ask, to free our spirits when we are in need, and to hold us and guide us into a new way of transforming love that will give us life. When we learn to receive God's forgiveness and transforming love, when we learn to forgive ourselves for wrongs we have committed, when we practice a forgiving love for life around us, and when we work together to build a community which promotes a responsible, genuine forgiveness based on just relationship with others, then we will find the freedom that only God can give. We will find the healing, life-giving wholeness we need. When we truly receive God's forgiveness so that we have the power of forgiveness in our hearts and are able to offer it to others, then we will discover, like Corrie ten Boom at the start of this sermon, that we might just find ourselves in those grace-filled moments when we can reach out to a former enemy, shake their hand and say, "Welcome, sister. Welcome, brother." Amen.